She walked into the pharmacy just like she had a dozen times before. Same routine, same prescription, same tired feet after another double shift. So why, just 10 minutes later, was she in handcuffs? Why were two police officers dragging a 58-year-old nurse out of the store like a criminal, without asking a single question? What happened that night in Savannah wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a blueprint of how quiet power can be abused, and how one woman's dignity, held steady in the face of humiliation, started a reckoning no one saw coming. This isn't a story about shouting. It's about standing. And what happens when the people who are always told to stay quiet stop accepting silence? It began like any other tired night in Savannah. The kind of night where the heat still clings to the sidewalk long after the sun has gone, and even the air feels like it needs rest. Ruth Harris, 58 years old, stepped out of her car beneath the flickering glow of a parking lot light. Her shoulders sagged, her feet throbbed, and the bones in her lower back pulsed from hours on her feet. But none of that mattered. She had one thing left to do before home: refill her prescription. She adjusted the strap of her worn leather purse, locked the door of her old sedan, and made her way toward the small neighborhood pharmacy. It sat quietly on the corner of a mostly shut-down strip mall, a fading fixture in a part of town where nothing seemed to change. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the kind of buzz you don't notice until everything else goes still. Only one customer browsed the cold medicine aisle. At the counter stood a bored-looking teenager, slouched over his phone, barely glancing up as Ruth approached. She offered a polite nod. "Evening." The boy gave a nod that barely qualified as acknowledgement. Ruth placed her ID, insurance card, and paper prescription on the counter. Routine. She'd done this dozens of times. The boy scanned the documents sluggishly, squinting at the screen as if the numbers didn't quite make sense. Then he paused, frowned, tapped, paused again. Without saying anything, he leaned toward the back room and whispered something to someone just out of sight. Moments later, the manager emerged. She was in her 40s, white, hair pulled tight, a name badge clipped crisply to her blouse. Her face had that cold, clipped look, like someone who spent years perfecting polite disapproval. She didn't look at Ruth. Not at first. She looked at the screen, tapped a few keys, leaned closer, then finally raised her eyes. Something passed in that look. Not surprise, not confusion. Just evaluation, then judgment. Ruth felt it. It was that subtle shift in the atmosphere, like static before a storm. Every black person knows it. The invisible shift in the air when suspicion creeps in, when eyes start to narrow and space around you starts to feel tight, crowded, dangerous. The manager finally approached the counter. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said with a tight, practiced smile, "but there's an issue with your prescription." Ruth blinked. Her voice remained level. "Issue?" "Yes, the insurance information isn't matching our records. We can't release the medication tonight." "That doesn't make sense," Ruth said, her voice still calm, but sharper now. "Everything is correct. You've filled this prescription for me every month for years. Same doctor, same insurance, same everything." The woman's fingers fidgeted at her side. She didn't move closer. In fact, she took a half step back. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to wait here. We've contacted the authorities to investigate." It landed like a slap. Ruth stared at her, the words hanging in the air like smoke. "Authorities?" she repeated, her voice lower now. Not shocked, not angry. Just still. The boy behind the counter looked away. The other customer had stopped moving, pretending to study a bottle of cough syrup, but very clearly listening. The manager's chin lifted, almost defiantly now. "We just want to be sure. It's policy when there's a potential for insurance fraud." Insurance fraud. Two words that said so much without saying anything honest. Ruth took a slow breath. She'd been in hospital rooms during code blues. She'd held dying patients' hands when no family came. She had walked grieving mothers down sterile hallways after delivering bad news. She knew how to stay composed when everything inside wanted to scream. But this was different. This wasn't tragedy. This was choice. These people had chosen to see her, not as a professional woman, not as a neighbor, not as a human being, but as a threat. Outside, she could hear the faint wail of sirens in the distance, like wolves approaching from far off. She could have left, could have demanded her papers back and stormed out, but that would have looked like guilt. That would have fit the story they were already writing about her. No, not tonight. She would not run from her own dignity. Ruth turned slightly and leaned her elbows on the counter, looking at the manager with eyes that had seen far worse than this. "You'll do what you think you need to do," she said softly, "but I've done nothing wrong, and I'm not going anywhere." The manager didn't respond, just turned and walked briskly back behind the desk, her lips pressed into a thin line. A silence fell over the store, the kind of silence that hums under your skin. Ruth stood tall, unmoving as minutes ticked by like hours. And then the doors chimed. 2 police officers entered, both white. The first one was big, square-jawed, with a buzz cut and that cocky posture of someone who'd never been told no. The second was younger, thinner, hovering just behind like he wasn't quite sure what he was part of. The manager rushed to greet them. "That's her," she said in a low hiss, pointing toward Ruth. "She tried to pick up medication with someone else's insurance. The names don't match." They didn't ask to see the computer, didn't ask to verify a single thing. The tall officer stepped forward, his hand already resting on his belt. "Ma'am," he said, his voice smooth but condescending, "I'm going to need you to step outside with us." Ruth didn't move. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, holding up her ID and insurance again. "This is all mine. Everything matches." The officer barely glanced at the documents. "Step outside," he repeated, and when she didn't move fast enough, he reached for her wrist. The cuffs were cold. The air was hot, and all around them, a silence thicker than any Georgia night settled in. Not a silence of peace. A silence of people watching something they'd seen too many times before. A silence full of phones being lifted quietly to record. A silence full of judgment, of shame, and of the first stirrings of something much, much bigger than anyone in that pharmacy realized. Because what they didn't know was, Ruth Harris was not alone. And this was just the beginning. The ride to the precinct was quiet. But it wasn't a gentle kind of quiet, the kind you find on a calm morning or late at night when the world is asleep. No, this was the kind of quiet that presses against your ribs and settles in your lungs like concrete. The kind that says, "Don't speak, don't move, don't give them anything." Ruth sat in the back seat of the cruiser, hands cuffed behind her. The metal bit into her wrists with every bump in the road. The lights of Savannah blurred past the window, casting long shadows across her face. She stared out, not blinking, not letting a single emotion show. Up front, the officer spoke like she wasn't even there. "Another one trying to pull a fast one," Senator Brad Connors muttered. "Unbelievable. What is it with these people thinking they can just take whatever they want?" Officer Jake Riley shifted in the passenger seat. He didn't respond. He didn't have to. His silence said enough. Ruth heard every word. She always had. She thought about the hours she'd spent today bandaging wounds, comforting the dying, walking children through fear and pain. She thought about the 12-year-old boy she'd held the hand of when his appendix ruptured. The grandmother she'd calmed during a panic attack. The man who'd clutched her wrist after surgery and whispered, "Thank you for saving me." None of it mattered here. Not now. Not to them. To them, she wasn't Ruth Harris, RN. She was a case number. A body in the back seat. A threat. They pulled into the station lot with a sharp turn. The building was squat and gray, windows dark. Inside, it was lit with that same flickering, fluorescent buzz, the kind that makes even the cleanest place feel dirty. Connors opened the door with a jerk. "Let's go. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." She stepped out slowly, refusing to let them see the pain in her knees, the ache in her back, refusing to let them take even 1 inch more than they already had. Other officers stood near the entrance, sipping coffee, talking in low voices. They didn't look at her, but they didn't not look either. Inside, they led her to the booking desk. The sergeant on duty, a heavy-set man with a fading mustache and tired eyes, barely glanced at her. Connors dropped the paperwork on the counter with a thud. Name, Ruth Harris, age 58, race, black, suspected insurance fraud. He said it loud, on purpose, like it was a sentence already passed. The sergeant shrugged. "Another one," he muttered, grabbing the fingerprint kit. They took her mugshot. Bright flash, cold click, a sound like a door slamming, then fingerprints. Rough hands pressing hers onto ink pads. No warning, no care. They moved fast, like they'd done this 1,000 times. Like she wasn't a person at all. Finally, they led her down a narrow hallway. The walls were stained, the tile floor chipped. Everything reeked of disinfectant and indifference. The holding cell door clanged open. They shoved her in. Connors leaned against the bars, arms crossed. His smirk had returned. "You want to tell us the real story now? Might help your case." Ruth sat on the cold metal bench. She didn't look at him. "The real story," she said quietly, "is you're going to regret tonight." Riley chuckled weakly behind him. "Yeah? You got a magic lawyer in your purse?" She said nothing. Connors scoffed. "Suit yourself." They walked away, their boots echoing like thunder down the hallway. Ruth exhaled slowly. Her hands rested carefully in her lap. Her spine stayed straight. She looked at the red marks on her wrists, at the way the cuffs had carved into her skin. She was tired, bone-tired, but not broken. And more importantly, she wasn't alone. Because she knew what they didn't. She knew who had picked up the phone when she was being marched out of that pharmacy. She knew who had dropped everything the moment they saw her face flash across a body cam feed. She knew that somewhere, not far from here, Elias Harris was already moving. And when Elias moved, the ground tended to shift. Outside the cell, the station hummed with its usual rhythm, casual, careless. But Ruth sat motionless, waiting, because sometimes justice doesn't come screaming in through the front door. Sometimes it arrives quietly, on the back of truth and patience and one very bad decision made by the wrong men on the wrong night. And tonight, the storm hadn't just started. It had already arrived. The first sign was the change in voices at the front of the station. It started subtle, a few raised tones, a nervous laugh. Then, the sound of a desk slapped hard enough to silence the room. "What do you mean someone's calling from DC at this hour?" That was Connors. Then, quieter, "Well, tell them they can shove it." Ruth didn't smile. Not yet, but deep inside she felt the shift. The air had changed. Moments later the phone rang again, longer this time, sharper. The desk sergeant answered. His voice dropped to a murmur. Then a pause, then louder, more clipped. "Yes, sir, she's here. Yes, sir, right away." The hallway lights seemed to dim just slightly, like the building itself was holding its breath. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, measured. The kind of footsteps that didn't rush, didn't need to. Ruth didn't need to see who it was. She already knew. Elias Harris, retired FBI special agent in charge, had walked into the building. And judging by the silence that followed, he hadn't come alone. The first officer to peek around the corner was Jake Riley. He looked pale, like someone had just shown him the last page of a story he didn't want to read. He whispered something urgent to Connors, who snapped back at him, low and furious. But it was too late. Because following behind Riley came two men in dark suits, shoulders squared, earpieces gleaming, and behind them, Elias. He hadn't aged much since retirement. Still sharp eyes, still that straight-backed presence. He didn't need a badge. He was the badge. He didn't look at the officers. He looked straight at Ruth, and in that quiet glance between them, everything changed. No words passed, but Ruth knew. "You're not alone anymore. I'm here." Then Elias turned. And when his eyes landed on Sergeant Brad Connors, the room tensed like a drawn bow. "Who's in charge here?" Elias asked, his voice low but heavy. No need to raise it. Power carried all by itself. The desk sergeant stumbled forward. That would be me, sir." "Good," Elias said, stepping closer. "Then you can explain why a licensed nurse with valid ID and no criminal record is sitting in a holding cell tonight." Connors tried to interrupt. Elias kept talking. "You can explain why your officers ignored clear evidence, why they initiated a public detainment with no probable cause, and why they placed her in handcuffs before verifying a single fact." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Each word dropped like iron. "You'll want to explain it," he said, "because of 10 minutes ago, you're no longer dealing with Savannah PD protocol. You're dealing with a federal civil rights investigation, and the Department of Justice is already on the line." Connors had gone from red to gray. Elias glanced toward the agents beside him. "Unlock the cell." One of them stepped forward, calm, professional, and produced the keys. Connors found his voice. "You can't just walk in here and—" But Elias turned slowly and looked him in the eye. "I already have." The key turned with a click. The door opened. Elias stepped back, not to walk in, but to offer his hand. But Ruth didn't take it right away. She stood on her own, back straight, shoulders square, her wrists marked, but her eyes steady. Only then did she give a slight nod. Only then did she walk out. The two federal agents flanked her. Elias followed, not in front, not behind, beside her. As they passed Connors, Ruth didn't glance his way. But she didn't need to. She could feel it. The silence, the fear, the unraveling happening behind those clenched jaws. And somewhere in that hollow space where arrogance had lived, the realization had finally landed. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The officers in the hallway didn't meet her eyes. The ones who had laughed earlier now stared at their boots. And the ones who had said nothing said even less. At the front desk, the phone rang again. The sergeant answered with a shaking hand. "Yes, sir. It's for you," he said, holding the receiver out to Elias like it might burn him. Elias took it calmly. "This is Harris," he said. There was a long pause. Then, "Good, proceed." He handed the phone back, like passing a cup. And just like that, everything that had felt untouchable in this building began to crack. Outside, Ruth stepped into the humid Georgia night. The air still clung to her skin, but something felt different. Lighter, sharper, like it was finally moving again. She didn't speak right away. Neither did Elias. They walked side by side toward his car. At the curb, he opened the passenger door for her. She looked at him. "You didn't have to come this fast," she said quietly. "I wasn't coming fast," Elias replied. "I was already on the way." They didn't say another word. He started the engine. The squad car sat in the rearview mirror, its lights still on, blinking into the night like it hadn't yet realized the rules had changed. Because they had. Tonight, the old rule, stay quiet, stay small, survive, had been broken. And in its place, something louder, something sharper, something just. The shift had begun. The station wasn't ready. They thought they were handling another late-night incident. Another tired black woman they could process and forget. They had no idea the storm had already arrived, wearing suits and carrying subpoenas. By morning, the Savannah Police Department had become ground zero. The first agents from the DOJ's Civil Rights Division arrived at dawn. They didn't come in quietly. 6 of them. 2 with federal badges, 4 with laptops and sealed evidence kits. No warnings, no requests, just authority and receipts. Ruth watched it unfold not from a distance, but from inside the DOJ's Mobile Operations Center, set up 2 blocks from the station. She sat in the corner, silent. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew her silence now carried weight. Across the room, Elias stood with Special Agent Olivia Reyes, lead on the DOJ team. Reyes was sharp, deliberate, and had the kind of voice that made grown men stop talking mid-sentence. "We're pulling every arrest report filed by Connors and Riley in the last 5 years, Reyes said. "Every use of force complaint. Every internal note that was marked confidential. If there's rot in this department, we're not stopping at the surface." Elias nodded. "Start with the body cam footage from last night. If they erased anything, we escalate." They didn't have to escalate, because by 8:15 a.m., a junior officer, nervous, sweating, slid a flash drive across the table to one of the agents. "No one's seen this yet," he said. "It's everything." And it was. The video played on screen. Ruth handing over her ID, calm and polite. The manager speaking to the officers in a hushed, giddy voice. Connors walking in with that smirk, grabbing Ruth's wrist before she could even finish a sentence. No resisting, no aggression, just Ruth, standing there, dignity intact, while they slapped cuffs on her like she was a threat. Agent Reyes leaned in, her expression unchanged. "She warned him," she murmured. "He didn't listen." The video ended. The silence in the room grew dense. Then Elias spoke. "Put it in the report. Annotate every timestamp. This is going federal." Meanwhile, back at the station, things were falling apart. Connors stormed from one hallway to the next, barking orders at officers who no longer made eye contact. Riley sat stiffly at his desk, chewing the edge of a styrofoam cup, his hands shaking. They could feel it. The unraveling. The weight of a system that had always protected them, now walking away. By noon, the media vans were outside. Cameras pressed to the glass. Reporters shouting questions into live microphones. Inside, an officer dropped a coffee mug. The crash echoed down the tiled hallway like a gunshot. Agent Reyes entered the squad room flanked by 2 federal techs. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She simply walked to the central terminal and said, "We need access to all disciplinary records, now." The desk sergeant hesitated. Elias stepped in behind her. "Unless you'd prefer to explain to a federal judge why you refused." The login credentials were handed over. The floodgates opened. It didn't take long. 15 excessive force complaints, 7 filed under Connor's name, 4 under Riley. 3 had been lost. 1 had been settled quietly. None had been resolved, buried under jargon, under silence. Under the same lie police departments had whispered for decades. We'll handle it internally. Only this time, they weren't. Out in the parking lot, a crowd had started to gather. Some had been at the pharmacy, others came because they saw the videos. Some came because they'd been waiting years for this crack in the wall. They didn't have signs yet, but they would. Inside, the DOJ team printed photos from other body cam clips. A black teenager slammed against a car hood, a young woman crying in the back of a cruiser. No charges filed, no reports written, just pain. Disappeared, until now. Connors tried to fight it. This is political, he snapped at Elias. You're making this a circus. Elias didn't flinch. You made this a pattern, he replied. We're just shining a light. Then, around 2:30 p.m., the mayor arrived. His face was pale. He had that tight, trembling smile politicians wear when they've already been told how this ends. He walked through the station like a stranger in his own city. Where is she? He asked quietly. In the ops van, Reyes replied. She's not giving interviews. She's watching. The mayor swallowed hard. Tell her we're gonna fix this. Reyes didn't answer. She just turned back to the screen. At 3:05 p.m., the DOJ issued a formal order. Savannah Police Department is under federal review. Effective immediately. 2 suspensions. Connors and Riley. Badges removed. Guns surrendered. Not with fanfare. Not with shouting. Just quiet finality. Ruth didn't watch it happen in person. She didn't need to. She felt it in the ground, in the shift of power, in the way the old playbook no longer worked. That evening, Elias sat beside her as the sun dipped behind the trees. She sipped water slowly, her wrists still red. You good? He asked. She nodded, but her eyes stayed on the van's monitor, watching the crowd outside the station grow. They thought I was alone, she said. Elias didn't respond right away. Then, they always do. The courtroom was quiet, but it wasn't empty. Every seat was filled, not just by reporters and attorneys, but by neighbors, nurses, teachers. People who had watched the footage, read the headlines, whispered to each other, that could have been me. Up front sat Ruth Harris. She wore a dark navy dress. Simple, clean, unapologetic. Beside her, Elias Harris sat tall in a pressed suit, jaw locked but calm. At the defense table, Brad Connors and Jake Riley. Their uniforms were gone now, replaced by ill-fitted suits and bloodshot eyes. The arrogance that once radiated from them like heat had evaporated. The judge read the verdicts one by one. Obstruction of justice, guilty. Unlawful arrest, guilty. Civil rights violation under color of law, guilty. Tampering with evidence, guilty. Each word landed with weight, not just on them, but on the room. Because this wasn't just punishment, it was recognition. When it was over, Ruth didn't cry. She didn't raise a fist. She just sat there, breathing. For the first time in what felt like forever, breathing without shame. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown again. Not angry this time, just present. Holding space, bearing witness. Elias guided Ruth to the steps. Reporters surged forward, cameras clicking. Miss Harris, do you have anything to say? Someone shouted. She stopped, turned, and looked into the sea of lenses and microphones and mouths waiting for a soundbite. Then she spoke, quietly. But the quiet made them listen. I didn't stand up so I could be seen, she said. I stood up so others wouldn't have to kneel. The microphones dropped slightly. I wasn't strong because I wanted to be. I was strong because I didn't have a choice. But now maybe some of us do. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't need it. She just turned and walked down the steps, shoulder to shoulder with her father, into a Savannah that suddenly felt a little less heavy. In the weeks that followed, the changes came quickly. The mayor announced sweeping reforms, independent oversight committees, body cam audits, a community advisory board. 2 more officers resigned quietly. The police chief retired early. And more importantly, complaints that had sat ignored for years were reopened. One by one, people stepped forward. Men, women, teenagers, grandparents, each carrying a story. Each carrying pain that had been told to sit down and be quiet. But now, because Ruth had stood up, the silence was cracking. Andre Collins, the civil rights attorney who took Ruth's case, called her one evening. They want to file a class action suit, he said. You're the obvious lead. Ruth hesitated. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "I know," Andre replied, "but they believe in you, because you didn't ask." So she said yes, and once again her name lit up headlines, not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a catalyst. Months later, Ruth stood at a small podium in a school gymnasium. It wasn't a fancy event, just folding chairs and a banner that read Community Resilience Night. She looked out at the crowd, teens with notebooks, elders in church clothes, mothers holding babies. She cleared her throat and told the story. Not with fire, not with fury, but with precision, with weight. She spoke about dignity, about how easy it is to lose it, and how hard it is to reclaim. And then, as always, she ended not with herself, but with a question. Who are you willing to stand for, even when no one's watching? That line stayed in the room long after the applause ended. Back home, Ruth sat on her porch most evenings, the same porch she'd rested on for years after long shifts. But now the rest felt different. Not because the fight was over, but because she wasn't fighting alone anymore. Elias would visit often. They'd sit in silence, sip sweet tea, and listen to the world move around them. "You know," he said once, "I used to think justice was a system." She raised an eyebrow. "And now?" "Now I think it's a decision," he said. "One you have to make again every day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Ruth nodded. She understood that better than anyone. When the national news cycle moved on, as it always does, Ruth didn't. She kept showing up to courtrooms, to classrooms, to quiet corners of communities where people still whispered their stories like secrets. And slowly, something remarkable began to happen. People started listening. People started believing. People started standing. And though she never asked for it, one morning, Ruth woke to find her face painted on the side of a community center wall downtown. Not heroic, not glowing, just steady, eyes open, back straight. Below her image, in bold letters, 4 words: she didn't look away. When we look back at Ruth Harris's story, it's easy to see it as a personal victory. But the truth is, it was never just about her. It was about every silent injustice that slipped through the cracks. Every person judged before they spoke. Every system that protected power instead of people. Ruth didn't raise her voice to be loud. She simply stood still, and that alone was enough to shift the ground beneath her feet. If you've ever felt misjudged, overlooked, or dismissed just for existing, comment 1 if someone ever made assumptions about you based on your appearance, your job, or your background. Comment 2 if you believe quiet kindness and quiet strength can still win in the end. And if stories like this matter to you, stories grounded in truth, in quiet courage, in dignity, subscribe to this channel, because there are more stories to tell, more voices to uplift, and more moments where someone chooses not to look away. Let's keep choosing to see.